Hello, AP US History. So, today we are going to be continuing our discussion on the lead up from the French and Indian War to the American Revolution. This is like all the big setup, all the major things that are happening in building to the revolution breaking out. So, let's go ahead and get back into it. Now, in the year 1760, George III becomes the new king of England. It begins parliamentary sovereignty. So this is basically like English officials in the colonies are basically, and over in England, are assuming that Parliament has like full control over all laws and taxes going on in the colonies. And the colonists, they try to basically keep the power in the colonial like leadership. But there's a lot of tension that happens here. Everybody thinks something different, and that's going to lead to some problems. Now, this phrase right here, no taxation without representation, that is one of the big sticklers that's going to cause a lot of issues with getting the revolution started. So colonists, they assume that, their assemblies would be basically equal to parliament because they had no parliament representatives over in England. So they thought that they would be able to have some sort of say over here and send word on their decisions back to England. But British officials, they countered with, virtual representation argument. That's basically like, nah, it's not going to work out. Colonists, they insist that only their colonial assemblies could tax Americans. The British are like, no, that's not the case. You're going to pay what we say. Now, this virtual representation, basically the idea that Parliament represents all British citizens no matter where they live. So, yeah, you don't get to put a representative in Parliament because we already represent you. It's not, yeah, it's not very good because now they can't have their true voice in the government, and they're expected to follow blindly whatever decisions are made. Now, we have our two theories about the extent of Parliament's authority over the colonies. Is it absolute or is it limited? Absolute means Parliament has unquestionable authority and can do whatever they want with the colonies and no one can say boo-hoo about it. Then there's limited, where it's like they can tell the colonies what to do and have more of a negotiation with the colonies about actually going through with something. But, it's not, it's one of those arguments that's going to lead to the big fight. Now, how can the colonies accept the decisions of Parliament when they did not have representation in that governmental body? That is the big question. And the revolution is pretty much the answer. Now, the breaking down of the bonds of empire. That is basically the breaking down of the British having control over the colonies. So after the 7 Years' War, everyone expected for King George to pull the troops out and bring them back to England because the French are no longer a threat in North America. But, things don't work out. The army ends up staying. It's expensive. And the British citizens are not happy with this because they have to pay for it. And by that, I mean the British citizens in the colonies. The colonists, they doubted the army's ability to even defend them against the Native Americans because they don't really know the best way to fight against Native Americans. They were only really good at fighting against the French, and the French are gone. And this basically gets proven with Pontiac's War. Now, this is in the newly acquired territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, like between the mountains and the Mississippi River, and right in the Great Lakes area, like Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, that area. Now, the successes of the Native Americans here are like way, way better than the British because they're pushing back against the white settlers who are wanting to move into the area. They are using the British Army's weaknesses against them, such as, using ambush tactics against them. because, the British, they just want to stand out in the field and fight. That's not how Native Americans fought. Now, the attacks, they're going to show how desperate the Native Americans are once the French are gone. So they're just taking every opportunity just to attack because they're desperate. And the colonial people, they're going to start taking matters into their own hands. One example is the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, and they were basically a group of guys who would get together and they would just attack Native Americans whenever they got the chance. That's essentially it. Right. Now, Pontiac, he is a chief of the Ottawa tribe, and among others who follow me, basically as a confederation or like a loose alliance with multiple tribes. And they are living in the Ohio area and the Great Lakes area. They kind of have like their own little confederacy nation, independent nation. And that's like the best way I can describe it. They have like their own independent Native American nation that the British are trying to push into the like settlers and take it from them, and they ain't having it. So, and this is partially because of them just going there, and partially because of, the British are intentionally trying to spread smallpox to their population and kill them out. So they're a little PO'd about that. All right. So this is the area we're looking at. We have the Great Lakes area here. This is where Pontiac and his people are. And all these different fire bursts, British forts being taken by the Native Americans, by the people of Ottawa, and the other tribes like the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, the Menominee, the Kickapoo, Muscotan, all of these, the Shawnee, and they're basically kicking a lot of butt. Now, there's going to be a lot of retaliatory attacks from the groups like the Paxton Boys, all these colonials, where they're going to basically be getting payback for the attacks on white settlers. And response to all of this violence is going to mean the British are going to establish the Proclamation Line of 1763. It basically forbids any white settlers going west of the Appalachian Mountains for their own protection. Basically, like, if you go over there on the other side of these mountains, we cannot protect you. And the American colonists were just like, we have every right to go over there. You conquered that land. You took it. Why should we be stuck not being able to use that land that is now technically ours? So here's a little map to show you what I'm talking about. So the Proclamation Line is this red line that goes basically from the Florida-Georgia border all the way up and around up to the above Maine. But they can't go into all this territory to the left of it because there's a lot of hostile natives. And the British Army can't do squat to protect people. Now, the introduction of parliamentary sovereignty contradicted the original policy of salutary neglect. And this is going to mean that we're switching from do whatever you want to you're going to do everything we want. And this influx, this new coming of a lot of political ideas from Europe, from their Enlightenment, are going to start impacting colonial ways of thought, especially the ideas of John Locke. And no colonists were thinking about independence up to 1763. Many of them were committed to natural rights and opposed to tyranny. And it's going to help. All this is going to shift. Now, the ideas of John Locke: all governments are susceptible or can fall to the ideas of being corrupt, having tyranny, imposing on people's rights, and that virtuous citizens must fight tyranny. So when you see corruption, you get rid of it. Now, Despite all the tensions mounting between England and the colonies, by 1763, most thought of themselves still as English citizens. They have the same culture, they use the same goods, they want the same things. They have a shared sense of nationalism. They are proud to be British. They love the fact that they beat the French in the French and Indian War. But it's only going to last but for so long, because we get the road to the American Revolution happening. So we are going to have a couple of events. The 1763, the switch of parliamentary to sovereignty, and we have the proclamation line. All those are going to lead to more and more problems. We're going to have the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, we have the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, Lexington and Concord. We're going to have the Boston Massacre. We're going to have the Declaration of Independence. All these things lead up to the Declaration. So, the Stamp Act. Britain is going to pass the Stamp Act, which basically means that the colonists have to purchase special stamps to prove payment of the tax. So you buy anything, it's got to have a special mark with it. And colonists, they basically boycott all British goods and just write all these letters, have these declarations of rights and grievances, like we have a major problem with this. You can't do this to us. Right? Little comic showing what I'm talking about. It's just an extra tax on all paper products. So there's going to be mobs that are going to trash places, burn things down, and it's the first time that boycotters are called patriots. Another political drawing here. These are not actually people up on pikes or hanging. These are dummies representing the British government, just so you know. Now, groups like the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty are going to form as these leading protest groups. They organize a lot of the uprisings and revolutionary doctrine that are going to happen. And the Townshend Acts are going to come next. So Britain is going to tax certain colonial imports, and they're going to have troops at the ports to protect the officials who are in charge of the collecting these taxes for trade. And the colonial reaction is the whole taxation without representation, and they're going to boycott a lot of imported goods from England now. All right, and this is an indirect tax. So it's not like we're directly going after something. You just have to pay a higher price on these goods now in place of a straight up tax that you're being charged. And it's things like lead, glass, paper, tea, a lot of things. Even more boycotts, more protests, more riots are going to happen now. These tax collectors, they're going to be tarred and feathered. Basically, they get a bunch of tar, which is like a sticky petroleum-based product, getting dumped all over them. They're going to be, pillows are going to be ripped apart, and all the feathers are going to be just thrown all over them, so they look like giant birds. All right. Now, the colonies, they're going to create these committees and that are going to voice all of their opinions and their protests against all the taxes that are being put on them, because we're definitely not hitting all of them. I'm just giving you some of the key ones. Now, the first big bloody event is the Boston Massacre of 1770. And the way that it works is we're going to see this right here is probably the best demonstration that I can give you for it. So we have just some neighborhood boys in Boston, teenagers, more than likely. They're throwing snowballs, some of them packed with ice, like slush that's packed up, squeeze the water out, you got an ice ball, throwing them at some guards at the customs house, which is where trading business is taken care of. Now, word starts spreading through the town that there's some trouble getting started. So a mob of citizens are going to flood into the town square. in response to all of this mob coming in, there's dozens, if not hundreds of people, we're going to have more British troops, like another 7 or 8 guys are going to come out to help this one or two guards that are here at the customs building. And the mob is then going to start attacking the soldiers by throwing stuff. There's going to be somebody who climbs up this building right here in the center to the top. There's a bell tower up there. It's going to start ringing the bell. People are going to start coming out of their houses yelling, "Where's the fire? Where's the fire?" And the soldiers, through all the noise, one of them hears the word fire. He shoots his gun. And his officer is then going to be like, "Why did you fire?" And the rest of the soldiers, he only hear the word fire. Then they open fire into the crowd, and 4 people get shot. And yeah, well, at least 5 people got shot, 5 of which were killed. And the first one that we're aware of who was actually killed was a guy named Crispus Attucks, who was a African American sailor, who was a free African American, who was a sailor by profession. He is counted as being like the first casualty of the American Revolution. All right. So things kind of go a little sour in Boston for a while. Trade gets shut down a bit, and it's held under military command now, the whole colony of Massachusetts, which Boston's the capital of. And then we get the Tea Act, where basically the East Indian Company, which is like the big trading company in the air in North America, they have control over the tea business, and they shut down all the private tea merchants, all the tea traders, and only they are doing business. And this is how we get the Boston Tea Party, when we have a bunch of colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians. They like jump onto these ships and they dump 18,000 pounds of tea into the harbor. This is only going to increase the problems where trade's shut down even longer, and more military control over the colony. All right, here's one depiction of the Tea Party. And the Intolerable Acts are the response. So this is like when everything happens. Boston Harbor is closed. No more trade. Troops are all over the city. Hundreds of them. Over 1,000 troops there. Colonial leaders meet for the First Continental Congress. This is the big reaction to draw up a declaration of colonial rights, saying like, you can't treat us like this. All the colonies sent representatives to Philadelphia for this, except for Georgia. And the reason why is Georgia was actually in the middle of fighting an Indian uprising, and they needed the British Army's help to do it. So they didn't send a representative, but they certainly had sentiments leaning in the aid of Massachusetts and along with the other colonies. They just couldn't voice them at that time. All right. So they want to help Boston out. They're going to send their demands to the king. It's basically going to fall on deaf ears. He's not going to do anything to help them because, like, hey, you're supposed to do what I say. I'm the king. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And so more and more tensions are going to build to where there's talk of actual revolution, and we're going to have rumors of colonists who are stockpiling weapons and ammunition and are having meetings and like forming militias and basically getting ready for a fight. So General Gage, the guy who is the military governor of Massachusetts now, centered in Boston, he is going to order I think it's about 700 troops to march out of Boston and head through Lexington to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize the weapons and to arrest some of the ringleaders of these people who are causing a lot of unrest by talking about revolution. And what's going to happen is a battle, the first battle of the revolution. So here is the path. They are marching out of Boston, following this route here, going up through Brookline, Cambridge, on up here to Lexington first, and then on to Concord. So in Lexington, when they get there, they are going to, well, as they're leaving Boston, there are colonist spies in Boston, and they start sending out the word to get the ride of Paul Revere, along with two other riders, one with the last name Dawes, one with the last name Prescott. They're going to send word all over the place to start calling up the militias to get ready for a fight because it's coming. So then the British are marching up to Lexington, where they meet about 70 Minutemen. So these are colonial militiamen. They are called Minutemen because they can be ready to fight at a minute's notice. And they are lined up facing each other. And out of nowhere, it's like crisp Sunday morning. And it's like early. The sun is just beginning to rise. So you're at the break of dawn. And you have 70 colonials, and you have basically a bunch of British troops who are marching into town. Figure about 100 of them are lined up against the 70. Out of nowhere, a shot rings out. The shot heard around the world because it is the beginning of the American Revolution. To this day, no one knows who fired that first shot. I don't know if anyone will ever know. But when that shot rings out, chaos ensues. Both sides open fire on one another. A lot of more Minutemen are killed and hit than British, and then they have to turn and run. The British are going to march through Lexington to Concord, where they're not going to be able to find any weapons, any prisoners to take. They don't find anything they're even looking for. So they then have to march their way back to Boston. But as this is happening, by dozens and hundreds, militiamen are coming in and basically chasing them back to Boston. They're shooting at them as they're marching down the road, and it basically turns into a huge battle that stretches over miles. All right. So that is the opening events of the American Revolution for getting the fighting started. But I did mention some of the political philosophies a little bit. I mentioned John Locke. So something to know about with this is the Enlightenment's influence. We've had the laws and some of the fighting, but now let's talk about some of the philosophies a little bit. So we have the Enlightenment, which is a new approach to science and politics and how they can affect society and what's going on. New ways of thinking about politics and society. And these ideas are going to spread. And they're going to spread to the American colonies, and they're going to influence the way people view their relationship with their governments. And they're going to see the abuses that are happening on them. It's like, hey, we've given them plenty of time to try and change their ways. They refuse. They won't stop the abuse on us. The only thing left is to fight. All right. 3 philosophers that are the most important to the American doctrine. Most important being John Locke, writing that people have natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and they should oppose tyranny wherever they find it. Then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he believed that citizens have a social contract with the government. We give up some of our natural freedoms to the government in exchange for protection from abuse or attack. And then we also have Montesquieu, who would argue that power should not be in the hands of a king, but separated into branches of government. Separation of powers, not consolidated in one, but spread into many who can keep each other in check so no one becomes abusive and power hungry and abusive with their powers. All ideas that we're going to put forward in our Declaration of Independence, and eventually when we write the law of our country, the Constitution, all these ideas will fall in there as well, as you will see when we get to that later on. All right, 1775, the British and American colonists are now fighting an informal revolutionary war. But of course, colonial leaders have not yet declared independence. During the Second Continental Congress, we're going to start seeing stuff like that happen. Because that same year, 1776, Thomas Paine's Common Sense is going to spread the idea of like, this is why we're fighting to the people. And it's going to convince a lot of people who are neutral on the issue of independence to then support independence. And that is when in 1776, the colonists are going to draft the Declaration of Independence and formally separate the colonies from the British Empire. And that's where we're going to end today. Be sure to come back next time when we're going to be talking about the fighting of the American Revolution, some key battles, key people, important events, all that stuff. All right, talk to you later.